I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's public event. We have a very illustrious panel of leading thinkers and experts here this evening to discuss one of the most critical issues that faces our world today, the consequences of the war on terrorism. Our discussants will be formally introduced to you by tonight's moderator and our distinguished Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism, Orville Schell. It's my first opportunity as Chancellor and a very special privilege to welcome to campus Mr. George Soros. He's smiling appreciatively on the side. George Soros is author of many influential publications on politics, society, and economics. His latest book, The Age of Fallibility, The Consequences of the War on Terrorism, is the catalyst for tonight's event. George is known throughout the world for his philanthropy dedicated to promoting open societies. In 1979, he began providing funds to help black students attend Cape Town University in apartheid South Africa. He has since established a network of philanthropic organizations active in more than 50 countries. His foundation network promotes the values of democracy in an open society, supporting projects in areas such as education, public health, and civic society development. Mr. Soros' Open Society Institute has been a steady support of various programs at the Graduate School of Journalism. We are honored to have him with us this evening. Universities have an important role to play in generating discussion and debate on the great issues facing the world. This is especially true of a preeminent university like ours, with a mission of service to the public. The Graduate School of Journalism has co-hosted a provocative series of public events over the years with my office, the Office of the Chancellor. These events provide a high visibility forum for debate on some of the most challenging issues of the day. I'd like especially to thank Mr. Richard Goldman for his generosity in funding the Goldman Forum on the Press and Foreign Affairs, which is a co-sponsor of this lecture this evening, together with the World Affairs Council. I know that you're all anxiously awaiting to hear our distinguished panelists, and so without further ado, let me hand the floor over to Dean Orville Schell. Orville.
Well, good evening. It's great to have you all here. As our panelists take their seats, let me just say a few words and then introduce them. This is the 5th anniversary of the war in Iraq. It is also, curiously enough, the 50th anniversary of George Orwell's great essay, Politics in the English Language. And we thought that this would be a good moment to mark this sort of particular stage in the evolution of this war. And I think even more interestingly, in the evolution of politics and what so often lies behind politics, namely language. I think we would all agree that there is a chain that goes from the way people think to the way they speak to the kind of action they can take and thus the kind of remedies that can be expected from them. The terrorism is real. But something I think most of us would agree has gone really awry in the way we have embraced our politics, the way this war began, and it remains to be seen how it will end. So I thought I would just begin this, read to you one little section from Orwell's really great essay, one of the first people to take note of how things can get corrupted down at the most basic level when language is corrupted. He said this is in 1946. He said, "In our time, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible, involving things that can be defended, but only by arguments which are too brutal for most people to face, and which do not square with the professed aims of political parties. This political language has consisted largely of euphemism, question-begging, and sheer cloudy vagueness. Defenseless villages are bombed from the air, the inhabitants are driven out into the countryside, the cattle machine-gunned, the huts set on fire with incendiary bullets. This is called pacification. Millions of peasants are robbed of their farms and sent trudging along the roads with no more than they can carry. This is called transfer of population, or rectification of frontiers. People are imprisoned for years without trial, or shot in the back of the neck, and this is called elimination of unreliable elements." And I think we would all have to acknowledge, lamentably, that much of this has come to pass now in our own society. Tonight, we really do have five extraordinary people. George Soros has just published a book which will be available in the lobby afterwards, The Age of Fallibility and the Consequences of the War on Terrorism. But we thought rather than just have him hold forth, we thought it would be interesting to assemble together a group of people from a whole variety of different fields of interest to discuss this topic. You know, what's become of our nation and where we are now at this 5-year mark into this particular war. So let me introduce the panelists. George Soros, we've already heard words about. Many of you know his work. Let me simply say one thing that I think is sort of quite bespeaks of his most singular role in our society. The former Prime Minister of Macedonia, Branko Crvenkovski, said this of him: "States have interests, but no principles. You," referring to Soros, "have principles, but no state." And I think that does describe his curious status as a stateless statesman. Next, Chris Edley, who's sitting right here in the end, trained as a lawyer at Harvard. He was editor of the an editor of the Law Review, a professor there, and he founded the Harvard Civil Rights Project, worked for Presidents Carter and Clinton, was a member of the Human Rights Commission, and now, since 2004, has been dean of Boalt Hall, the law school here at Berkeley. Dana Priest, who's sitting next to Chris, has worked for 20 years at the Washington Post and is a special on national security and defense issues. She is author of The Mission, Waging War and Keeping Peace with America's Military. She's a winner of many awards, including the George Polk Award, and most recently a Pulitzer Prize for her overseas reporting on secret prisons and renditions. And the Pulitzer Committee In giving Dana her award, they cited her persistent, painstaking reports on secret black site prisons and other controversial features of the government's counterterrorism program. On the far right, we have Lowell Bergman, who was a longtime producer at 60 Minutes for Mike Wallace. Many of you saw the movie The Insider, where Al Pacino played Lowell. More recently, he's been an investigative reporter for the New York Times, where he too won a Pulitzer. He's now working as a frontline correspondent. He's now working at our project with Frontline here at Berkeley on a whole series of films, 4 hours on the media, funded by Richard Goldman, who is making this evening possible as well. And he's also working on a film to be aired over PBS October 16th called The Enemy Within, on terrorism in the United States. And sitting next to Lowell is Mark Danner. I should say also that Lowell has just become the Reva and David Logan Distinguished Chair in Investigative Reporting at the Graduate School of Journalism. And I think John Logan is in the audience, if I'm not mistaken. And thank you, Logan family. And it's a great honor for all of us to have this chair. Mark Danner is a graduate from Harvard, longtime contributor to The New Yorker and the New York Review of Books, MacArthur Fellow, has made numerous trips to Iraq reporting for the Review. He's author, most recently, of 2 books on Iraq, Torture and Truth, Abu Ghraib and the War on Terror, and The Way to War and the Downing Street Memo, Iraq's Buried History. He, too, is a professor at the Graduate School of Journalism. So welcome all of them, if you please. Now, what I think we'll do here, I've asked if each of our distinguished panelists would hold forth for 6 or 7 minutes. We may give George, who's going to start, a few more minutes. I will try to watch the watch. I hope you will watch yours. And then we're going to just throw this open for discussion among us. But let me try to start this off just by pitching a question to you, George, and to each of the others. You wrote in your book the following: how is it that the oldest, most successful open society has become the victim of misconceptions? And you ask several places in the book, what's wrong with America?
Well, in my book, I tried to provide a sort of a philosophical basis of the role of misconceptions generally. And of course, one of the worst misconceptions and one of the best demonstration of how important misconceptions can be is the war on terror. I mean, everybody now, or most people now, realize that the invasion of Iraq was a blunder, but the war on terror is still accepted as the sort of the frame in which we have to think, defining America's role, America's mission in the world. And it is actually a false and misleading metaphor. It's very powerful because it's natural that if you are attacked by terrorists, you have to defend yourself. Naturally, you wage war. But and there is no easy metaphor to replace it. That's what makes it so powerful. But it is very misleading. And one of the main points I'm trying to make in the book is that until we recognize this, we will not be able to write our course. We can't correct and regain our legitimate and proper place in the world. So if you bear with me, I'll just give you what's wrong with that metaphor. I'll mention 4 things. One, that it is counterproductive, that waging war on terror actually has reinforced the terrorist threat. Secondly, it has undermined our open society, because a critical process is essential for an open society. And for about 18 months after President Bush declared war on terror, criticism was considered unpatriotic. The USA Patriot Act passed with only 1 dissenting vote. And of course, it's because of the lack of a critical process that we could commit the blunder that we did with the invasion of Iraq. It is now clear that a lot of voices were within the administration warning about the dangers, but those voices had no resonance. They were not heard. Thirdly, the war on terror basically undermines our democratic constitution, which is based on the division of powers. We now have a war president with arrogating exceptional powers, and of course it's a war that will never end. And if we don't repudiate the war on terror, we could in fact lose the very foundations of our democracy. And we have a Supreme Court now where there are judges who actually believe in this undue extension of executive powers. And the fourth is that by making the war on terror as the centerpiece of our mission, we fail to fulfill the role, the task that we should be fulfilling. Because as the leaders of the world, we ought to be concerned with the problems of humanity that require international cooperation, and we ought to be leading in that. And we are failing, and issues like global warming, which are really very pressing, are not dealt with. So this is the fourth objection to the war on terror. Let me be maybe a little bit didactic, but let me now deal with the first of these. What is it that has made the war on terror counterproductive? And again, I identify four factors. Incidentally, these are not exclusive. There may be others that one could mention, but I just select these four. First of all, war creates innocent victims. And this is in the nature of war. And of course, war against terrorists, difficult to locate, are even more likely to create innocent victims. Now, we abhor terrorism because it kills innocent people for political goals. And when we are doing the same thing, we are perceived in the same way as we perceive the terrorists. This is very difficult for us to understand because we are good people, and how can we be looked on like that? But actually, that is what is happening in the world today. That's why you have such a gap between our perception of ourselves and the way the rest of the world is perceiving us. And generally speaking, innocent victims, humiliation, occupation, generate rage and resentment, which feeds right into the terrorist course. And when you look at the world today, you see that what has been a figure of speech, the war on terror, has actually become a real war, which we are fighting on a number of fronts. So that's the first and most important factor. But the second, war on terror is an abstraction. And by putting all the manifestations, all the political movements that use terrorism as a means of achieving their end in one basket. And that stops us from distinguishing between them. And in effect, Al-Qaeda Hamas and Hezbollah and the Sunni insurrection in Iraq and the Mahdi army in Iraq. These are all very different forces, and we need to deal with them concretely and deal with them differently. And having them all under this one abstraction prevents us from dealing with them appropriately. Thirdly, war on terror emphasizes military means. Now, sometimes military action is justified, like the invasion of Afghanistan. That's where bin Laden lived. That's where the training camps were. So it was appropriate to go in there. We were very successful. We were greeted as liberators. And had we stuck to that, and had we actually engaged in nation building, which at the time was considered a pejorative term, I think history would have taken a very different course, and actually bin Laden would have no place to hide, because Afghanistan would be secure, which it isn't now. I think finally, the war on terror creates a gap, a chasm between us and them. We are the victims, they are the perpetrators. And this prevents us from seeing that our actions have an effect on their behavior. And even to say that that is the case is considered somehow inappropriate. President Bush tells us that they hate us because of what we are, not what we do, for what we do. And I think that is false. So with those four things together, it create a self-reinforcing vicious circle of escalating violence. And all you need to look at the conditions, the position that we were in on 9/11/2001, when we were the unquestioned leading power in the world. We set the agenda for the world. The rest of the world had to respond to it. No external power or combination of powers, whether it's state or non-state, could really endanger us. And we could project overwhelming force at any part of the world, which was one of the requirements of the Bush Doctrine. Today, that is no longer the case, because we are bogged down in Iraq, and we no longer set the agenda. There are other players with their own agendas to which we have to respond, and very often don't know how to do it. And the result is that the world has become a much more unstable place. And as I said before, until we recognize that we are on the wrong course, we will not be able to remedy this situation. We are being told that our will is being tested in the streets of Baghdad. It is not our will that is being tested, but our understanding of reality.
Well, thank you. Now we'll go to Lowell Bergman, a very sort of accomplished reporter, has his nose right down in the burrow. Let me ask you this, Lowell, just to get you going. Spain has been attacked. The UK has been attacked. Germany had a near catastrophe. We've not been attacked. Aren't we doing something right in this country?
Well, let me just say to start that this is the 5th anniversary of the attack, the 3rd anniversary of our invasion of Iraq, and we were attacked, and it was an unprecedented attack, unprecedented anywhere in the world, really, in terms of an attack like that. And so to try to understand, I think, some of the reaction, some of the overreaction that I think many people have criticized, we have to remember those days and what happened. But what I have been pursuing for a while now, and I've been covering various terrorist groups from Hezbollah to others over the years, and actually bin Laden before 9/11, and then intensively afterwards. And as you mentioned, London and Madrid, in particular, we were in Europe covering those, and a new phenomenon was put on the map, which was so-called homegrown terrorism. That is, groups within countries committing terrorist attacks. And remember again, 9/11 was carried out by a group that came here. All the investigations, the 9/11 Commission, the FBI, all the investigations that have taken place have demonstrated, at least so far, that there were no witting accomplices here in the United States. That this was carried out by an organization based overseas, financed and recruited from the Middle East in the Persian Gulf region, Afghanistan, and Germany. And so we have not yet, and this is one of the things that we've been working on recently, we have not yet found any al-Qaeda network inside the United States since 9/11. We've found sympathizers, people who are connected, but I think even the FBI, I know the FBI on the record, will say that they have not found any al-Qaeda network inside the United States. Now, maybe, as one person I interviewed recently said, they just don't know. Whereas another said, they're probably here, but we won't see them for a while. They are actually asleep. But the fact is, when pressed, the government of the United States will say, I think without dissent, that there is no al-Qaeda network, and that now what they're looking for are homegrown terrorists here in the United States. And here we have a couple of great advantages. Number one, and this is something that I know speaking with people in the Muslim community in the United States is something that they would hope the President would do more about, or that some of our agencies would come public on, and that is our Muslim community in the United States is not only one of the most prosperous and well-educated in the world, but also is probably one of the most patriotic in terms of a Muslim community in the Western world. Our Muslim community is unlike the one in Europe because we are a heterogeneous country, is much more integrated into the society and much less of an ally to anyone who is preaching violent jihad. But I think we are in a much more dangerous situation when the President of the United States starts to use words like Islamofascism. I don't know, somebody invented that term recently. It's a very difficult one. I think any of you have studied the history of political movements to make any sense out of, but it's one that was invented apparently in the White House. But it has an alienating effect on the people it's aimed at in this country. The other thing, though, that I think that we have to maintain an understanding of, and this is, I think, the great difficulty when I listen to criticisms of what is going on. First of all, I think we're at a crossroads. I think inside the senior bureaucracy in Washington, or what many of us who cover this from a reporting point of view, the more knowledgeable, let's say, people in various institutions who have a greater understanding of what's going on, there is a real understanding. You cannot make war on a tactic, which is terrorism. You can't win a war doing it that way. And when you ask anybody or push them on it, they'll say, well, that's the president's term, so that's why we're using it. There is a developing understanding that we have to have a much more subtle and in-depth approach to the problem, at the same time being aware that there are a lot of people out there who wish us and will do us harm. As surprising, I know everyone in this room was shocked by 9/11, and it could happen again. I don't think it will happen, from what I've seen so far, from inside the United States. But it is interesting that we have not had one attack, not one backpack bomber, not one shooting other than the sniper in Maryland and back east since 9/11. And it says something which really hasn't been explained as to what the real situation is in the world, what the nature of our enemy is. And then finally, we have, I think, a huge problem to deal with in the future if we start to recalibrate, if we, let's say, sit back and start to look at the problem rationally, that what do we do about what we have already done to ourselves? And that is not something that I think you can simply blame on the Bush administration. The Department of Homeland Security was a Democratic Party idea, which the Bush administration adopted. The reorganization of the intelligence community and the creation of this Directorate of National Intelligence, which many people feel is just another bureaucracy on top of bureaucracy, was created through bipartisan votes. So I think one of the things that needs to happen is, and maybe I'm dreaming, is for this country to step back and reevaluate the reality of 9/11, the reality of the threat from overseas, and how we're going to approach it.
Thanks, Lowell. Let's turn now to Dana Priest. Dana, I'm curious to ask you, because you work in Washington. Your articles for which you won the Pulitzer Prize were extremely, I think, embarrassing and revelatory. How do you find that the whole craft of journalism works in Washington now? Is it absorbed? How do people react to you? Do you feel that the work you're doing, the research you're coming up with, the articles you're writing are having an effect? And if so, describe it.
Well, not immediately. I mean, it took the immediate reaction to the stories that I did about the interrogation techniques that the CIA used, and then unraveling of secret prisons, which actually took 3 years to do, had no immediate effect on anything, really, because in part, we would write it. People who found it were questionable, like human rights groups, would protest the fact that it was going on. But there was never, in Washington, I think of it often as an echo chamber. If there's a salient debate to be had and the opposition party can take it and use it to their advantage, there'll be this echo effect in Washington where things reverberate, they get bigger and the debate gets bigger. But what I find, even to this day, but particularly right after 9/11 for the first 3 or 4 years, was that there was no opposition party willing to debate the most important and really tough questions, like how do you find terrorists, what do you do when you catch them, how do you get information out of them. So my stories had an absolute, there was no Democratic Party response except a very few people, and they pretty much ended there. Now that wasn't true in Europe, where the story about the black sites being in Eastern Europe shocked Europe, and in particular because in Eastern Europe these prisons were illegal in the countries in which they were operating, because they, like us, work under a rule of law, and they offered these prisoners no rights under the rule of law. So that resounded in Europe, and as you probably know, the European Parliament and the Council of Europe have both continued to investigate the prisons and continue to be denied any kind of information from the few number of people that would actually have the information. And our government, its main response to the stories and to the stories of other journalists who've written about renditions is to not deny the stories, because they can't, they haven't done that because they know they're true, but is just to not say anything about them, and then, as you probably read, to launch these very vigorous investigations, leak investigations, which has had, to some extent, a chilling effect on what we do and has made our job a lot more difficult to carry out. But journalists are committed to doing that. I think there's a very strong feeling among the national security reporters. If you look back over the last 3 or 4 years, actually 5 years, but I would say the first 18 months, as you were saying, George, there wasn't a lot of criticism, but it was often because we were trying to figure out what just happened and how did we miss such a threat out there. But after the first 18 months, reporters did start getting inklings that something was very different than the world that they understood. And because it was such tough going, these stories took an inordinate amount of time to produce. I remember working on a story about one Afghan who had been picked up in Afghanistan on suspicion of bombing a base and taken to a place called the Salt Pit, which I originally in a story a year earlier had called the Pit. It took that long for me to figure out that its real name was the Salt Pit, and it took another 8 months to actually produce what was probably a 30-inch story talking about one Afghan whose name I still don't know, who was killed by an Afghan guard but under the supervision of the CIA. And for me, I remember, because the reporting was so difficult along the way and I had other things to do, just saying, you know, am I crazy? Just, you know, this is one guy and we don't know his name, and kept going and finally produced one story that caused, I learned later, the intelligence committees at least to start asking some questions. One of the other points that I wanted to make, and then I have to finish that story by saying that even though there was no reaction to these stories, or not much when they were published, the president 2 weeks ago confirmed the existence of the black sites. And it was very satisfying to me. What he's now done is to say, if you don't make these legal, and if you don't make these interrogation techniques legal, well then, by God, the CIA is not going to be able to do them anymore. And that will be your fault. But the opposition party, again, the Democrats, are basically nowhere to be found on it. And it is 3 Republicans, moderate Republicans, all of whom have had military backgrounds. One, McCain, who was a POW, and one who was a JAG officer, is still a reserve JAG officer, who have challenged the administration and probably have the backbone to do it, and I think the backbone to continue. And if there is to be a debate, it's these moderate Republicans who are bringing it to the fore. The final point that I wanted to make, since I feel like I'm sort of inside the, in some way, inside the workings of the CIA on this whole issue, is that it really was within the agency, it came from within the agency that these doubts about the program bubbled up. And it was about 18 months after the panic. And most of these programs, all of them, were put in place because people were panicked and because the CIA was asked and given the authority under the presidential finding, covert action, to undertake what really has become the largest covert action since the height of the Cold War, and included everything from, well, it included answering this question: what do you do when you find, how do you find the terrorists, and what do you do once you find them? And the CIA had no interrogators, they had no interrogation techniques, they certainly didn't have prisons to put people into. And there they were on the battlefield in Afghanistan with people running around who they knew were bad guys, and then a couple of them they caught who were the leaders of Al-Qaeda. And the question became, what do you do with them? And that's how the system started. And it was when people realized that the threat, that there wasn't a second plot looming, from what Lowell was saying, that they began to say, what is the end game here? And the agency officials said that among themselves and to their director at the time, George Tenet, with various motivations. One is, we are going to be left holding the bag when the pendulum swings in the other direction. Other people thought, you know, this is repugnant, and someday someone's going to get hauled up and prosecuted for it. And other people thought, we can't be jailers, we're a tiny agency, so let's give it to the Defense Department. And the Defense Department said, no way. And they still have said that. So it really came from agency people that these stories eventually made themselves out into the public. So I guess I'll leave you with that and welcome questions from everybody else.
All right, let's turn to Chris Edley. Chris, I'm wondering, just as a starting point for you, do you think it's possible for any society, particularly a Western society in this day and age, to be safe without arrogating unto itself special extra-legal and perhaps extra-constitutional privileges and maybe some very harsh interrogation techniques to extract information.
Can I have a different question?
After you answer this question.
Look,
the free choice is the next round.
Before I answer, is anybody else? I've only been here 2 years, and I keep feeling the stage shake a little bit.
It's the earthquake.
Is that an earthquake? I'm sorry. I'm just having a little trouble focusing. As Orville said, I have worked in 2 administrations, and towards the end of the Clinton administration, I was no longer working at the White House. I was back at Harvard producing footnotes to save Western civilization, but my wife was deputy chief of staff to the president. And I was commuting back and forth. And there was one morning, we were in Washington. There was one morning, and Maria had been restless all night. And I said, sweetheart, you didn't sleep very well. What's wrong? And she said, oh, yeah, the world is a really dangerous place. Because she got the CIA briefings every morning, read the presidential daily briefing, and so the world's a really dangerous place. What do you mean? Oh, I can't talk about it, but the world's a really dangerous place. And so we were in the bathroom at 6 a.m. having our morning policy seminar, and I was shaving, and she was in the shower, and I said, sweetheart, remind me, what's the state of the law about presidentially directed assassinations? If we could find terrorists, or if we were, a real problem, somebody's building a nuclear weapon, what's the law about that? Silence. I said, Maria, what about assassinations? And she said, change the subject. And I think it was the next day that the cruise missiles went after the terrorist camps in Afghanistan. I think that anyone who believes that the answer to the clash of values, priorities, perceptions related to security on the one hand and civil liberties or human rights on the other, anyone who believes that those are simple matters to resolve, in my judgment, is not thinking about them seriously. The world is a dangerous place. Obviously, the dangers can be either exaggerated or minimized as a matter of discourse or ideological combat. And of course, it's especially difficult for many of us to make a judgment about the magnitude of the problems when there is so much secrecy, much of it, I'm sure, unjustified. But balances will be struck, and they will be restruck over time. I thought Dana's last point about the sense of urgency and crisis that was so prominent in the months following 9/11 within the CIA and almost everywhere is a point extremely well taken, that fortunately, because this is an open society, there are some mechanisms of correction so that over time, perhaps not at the pace we would like, perhaps not with the care that we would like, corrections do take place, and there is a tendency back, I believe, toward an equilibrium that reflects our values as those values evolve over time. We're not so good, not as good as we'd like to be on preventing the abuses in the first instance. But I think it's important to focus on both pieces of the problem. Prevention, but also, when that fails, correction in a dynamic fashion. Period, paragraph. My greatest anxiety, therefore, is actually less about where the balance will be struck at any particular moment or at any particular controversy than it is, forgive the lawyer in me, around some of the procedural or process-related dimensions of that balance striking. That is to say, who's sitting around the table making those judgments on our behalf and reflecting which values and accountable to whom. In that process, we face two gigantic handicaps. One, the short-term and relatively easily remedied one, is one-party government and the erosion of appropriate checks and balances that follows from that. A second, deeper, and I think more lasting challenge is the problem that we have dealing with difference. George spoke in passing about us versus them, but there is a global problem of the rise of tribalism, if you will, whether in religious fundamentalism or surging nationalism, ethnic nationalism. And America is not immune to that, and it would be hubris to think that we are. We have some safeguards against it, but they are imperfect. So when judgments are made about whether it is inappropriately intrusive to do massive data mining or to plant covert agents in mosques or to require that immigrants from a certain part of the world register, or that we create a national ID card, when ideas of this sort are floated and the proponents say, look, it's not that much of an imposition. Well, it's not that much of an imposition on whom? And exactly whose ox is being gored when these civil liberties are being nipped and tucked, trimmed to accommodate our sense of crisis and urgency. I think at a fundamental level, it is in part our inability to understand people in other countries who are dramatically different from us that leads not only to foreign policy disasters, but the parallel difficulties of understanding people who are different domestically that creates risks of civil liberties abuses here at home. So my answer, Orville, in a backhanded way is, well, yeah, we can be safe and have civil liberties. The question is how safe and what kind of civil liberties. And the magic of our constitutional process should be in not the absolutes, with all due respect to mavens of the First Amendment, but in the living document sense of an evolution of our society to meet its challenges. I just want to make sure that the way we define America's values and their instantiation is one that takes due account of an inclusive kind of participation, a truly democratic participation in defining and enforcing those values.
Thank you, Chris. We turn to Mark Danner. Mark, just to get you going, I think figuratively speaking,
Can I have Chris's question? I'll say no.
I mean, Iraq is the heart of the matter. Without remedy there, it seems to me there's going to be very little remedy elsewhere. So here's the question. Are there any good alternatives in Iraq?
No.
All right, let's move on now to the... Please.
Thank you. No, I don't think there are good alternatives. you know, I saw earlier today, I was looking at the Iraq Index, which is this wonderful database at the Brookings site, which gives you all numbers associated with Iraq, numbers of attacks, numbers of kidnappings, numbers of dead, and saw that the estimate, the very conservative estimate that Brookings has of number of dead civilians in Iraq is now topped 60,000. And as I say, that's a very conservative estimate. It's basically a hospital, in one way or another, a hospital count. The usual way to judge this is that Iraq's population is a 12th, roughly the size of the US. So on the American population, we'd be talking about 720,000 dead civilians. And the only number I think that's close to that would be the Civil War dead, which is something over 500,000 soldiers mostly. So the scale of carnage in Iraq is very difficult to conceive, and because we're getting less and less picture of Iraq on our television sets at night, which is where most Americans get their news, it's becoming, I think, more distant and more abstract all the time, and the war continues. As Orville knows, I was in Washington this morning talking to the Iraq Study Commission, which is a commission mandated by Congress and under the chairmanship of James Baker, the former Secretary of State, and Lee Hamilton, the former representative who ran the 9/11 Commission, to essentially find a way out, under the presumption that if a way out was found, the administration might take it. We all laughed about that too this morning. And the atmosphere there was quite grim. I think there was a general premise that, in fact, the administration is going to run out the string, which is to say, for the next couple of years, policy won't change terribly much. And as the president has said, this will become a problem for the next president, because taking any steps that might lead to withdrawal would be politically painful and an admission of a mistake, as if most Americans didn't know by now that it was a mistake, as if that was a secret. I think the situation in Iraq is very grave. And I don't think there's an easy way out or an easy prescription one can give for it. I think it's fascinating in the broader war on terror, which, as Orville said at the beginning, we're celebrating the 5th anniversary of. Iraq plays an interesting role. It's clear, we know from a lot of information, that one of the things Osama bin Laden and his colleagues were trying to achieve on 9/11 was to provoke an American attack that they expected to come in Afghanistan. The idea was, you know, this is the strategy of provocation. You get your enemy, the much bigger enemy, because you can't defeat the United States. You get the United States to defeat itself. Bin Laden and Zawahiri thought there would be an attack in Afghanistan, which of course there was, but they thought that it would lead to the kind of stalemate that the Soviet Union suffered there in the 80s, and which spelled the end of the Soviet Union, a historical event for which al-Qaeda feels itself to be responsible. They thought they could conquer the second superpower this way. The administration avoided that, but gave them precisely what they wanted, which was images of Americans abusing Muslims, images of American tanks rolling down the streets of an Islamic capital, and so on, in Iraq. And to a degree that I think they could not have anticipated. So it was a step that was, politically speaking, extremely useful to al-Qaeda, and that increased the number of jihadists worldwide, I think, to an enormous degree. A question asked a few years ago by Donald Rumsfeld in the secret memo, are we increasing the number of those who want to fight against us much more rapidly than we're capturing or killing them? And I think the answer to that, unquestionably, is yes. The president said in a news conference a couple weeks ago that, talking about Iraq, he said, you need to defeat an ideology, presumably Islamo-fascism, as Lowell Lowell put it, you need to put opposite it another ideology, a competing ideology, which would be freedom. Democracy, exactly, as George says, freedom. The problem is that the images that are coming out of Iraq are not the ones that the administration planned when they determined to launch the attack, the invasion, the occupation. I have to, sort of reel back, as I was thinking of this morning, that, I was on this stage, whatever it was, it's more than 3 years ago, a couple of months before the war. It was the night of the President's State of the Union address, in which he uttered the famous 16 words, the British have determined that Saddam Hussein is searching for uranium in Africa. That night, I had a debate here with Christopher Hitchens. It was a couple of months before the war. And I remember this vividly. I was trying to make the point that the threat of Saddam Hussein, it was very clear, was being relentlessly exaggerated. And it was also very clear that the threat and the risk of an occupation of Iraq was being relentlessly minimized. And Christopher referred, and it was a full house, as tonight, Christopher constantly elided the difference between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, saying things like, we've been attacked, we must strike back. And I remember vividly coming from the crowd when he said something like that, this kind of roar of power. There was a lot of support for the invasion of Iraq in this hall that night, just as there was a lot of support within the country until relatively recently. And it seems to me when we talk about the consequences of the war on terror, we have to, rather than scratching our heads and spitting and thinking how horrible our governors are, we have also to look at ourselves and how we have changed in the last 5 years. When I woke up in Washington today, I looked at the front page of the Washington Post. The lead article was about McCain's position on interrogation, which is to say torture, may hurt him in 2008. This was the lead in the Washington Post. What is McCain's position on torture? He's again it. And I read a story in the Inside, and it was about the negotiations between the administration and moderate Republicans in the Senate. And the idea was, well, we're going to take waterboarding off the table, as it were. And, waterboarding, as I'm sure everybody here knows, is you strap someone down. They're usually naked. They've usually been beaten or stressed in various ways through sleep deprivation or use of noise and other things. You strap them down, you tilt them so their head is lower than their feet, and pour water on their face or dump their head in a bucket, which is what the Latin Americans did when I was covering there in the 80s. They called it El Submarino. And of course, the Spanish Inquisition before it called it water torture. Now we cannot use the word torture because the United States does not torture. But I was looking at this in the paper and thinking, well, here's a negotiation about taking waterboarding off the table, but we want to keep cold cell. Cold cell is essentially having somebody stand naked and cell immobile, dousing them with water every hour or periodically, cold water, keeping the temperature in the 50s or lower, and forcing them to stand for as much as 40 hours, which is excruciatingly painful. And this is being debated in Congress at the moment, trying to make some kind of deal. The President gave a speech last week from the White House talking about the alternative set of procedures, it was called, the alternative set of procedures that our professionals, that was the other euphemism, are using. And I bring all this up because this has become a regular part of our politics. We live with it, we read about it in the paper, we debate it, and the governing party has brought it up as an issue in September of an election year because they think they can win with it. That is, they think they can put the Democrats in a defensive position, show them weak on the war on terror, and win the election, or at least make progress in not losing so much. So the war on terror, when I think of the consequences, which is our subject tonight, one of the great consequences is the transformation that's happened within us and what we are willing to endure what we're willing to read about in the newspaper, what we're willing to put up with. I was fascinated by Christopher Edley's talk about the balance, in response to Orville's question about the balance between civil rights and safety. I think that's the wrong metaphor, frankly, the balance. I think it's a very damaging metaphor because it implies that every time you add to human rights or civil rights, you're subtracting, it's like a seesaw, you're subtracting from safety or security, which is emphatically not true. Terror has become an inextricable part of our politics. And I take George's point very much to heart when he talks about terrorism being an abstraction. As Lowell said as well, a military theorist said to me not long after 9/11, declaring war on terror is like declaring war on air power. You know, it's a technique. But the fact is that it's not, in the end, an abstraction. Because we're talking about a lucrative political emotion, an emotion that is deeply attractive to politicians, because you are able to motivate people, motivate them through fear to do certain things. It's also lucrative for many of us sitting on stage here, that is for the press, for the media. So terrorism has advantages for certain people, and certain parts of the society have used it very much to their profit during the last 5 years. Christopher Edley talked about the fact that we're living in under a one-party government at the moment. That is true, that's very important. But we're also, the opposition party is quiet for a reason, which is that whenever they've raised their head above the level of silence, they've been smacked down in a way that's been very effective. The administration, for all its lack of competence in many, many areas, in Iraq, Katrina, we can go through the list, has shown itself to deploy an almost virtuosic proficiency in using the war on terror politically. And one of the things we've learned in 5 years is that when we're frightened, we're willing to do just about anything and put up with just about anything. And I want to make a final point, which is that let's get back to President Bush's point about ideology. You can only defeat an ideology with another ideology, which is to say freedom or democracy. That has been one of the points he's made from the beginning. And I agree with what George said, which is that bin Laden actually made a joke about this in one of his tapes before the 2004 election. If we're attacking freedom, he said, why don't we attack Sweden? The fact is, though, that one of the successes, Al-Qaeda has suffered a lot of reversals. A lot of its leadership has been killed and dispersed. A lot of its agents have been killed. On the other hand, it's changed from a group of people to an ideology, in essence, whose techniques can be learned on the internet. And Lowell talked about this, the notion of homegrown terrorists, people in London, for example, who the thing you need is the will. You don't need to go to Afghanistan to train. You can find out how to make these bombs by just, booting up the computer. So Al-Qaeda has had successes, but I think one of their greatest successes has been to take the ideology of what America represented, and George writes about this very eloquently in his book, to take that ideology, to take that picture, the way we like to think of ourselves, and to undermine it in the world in a quite astonishing extent. When you travel in the Middle East, you see on murals, like a glyph everywhere, the image of Hooded Man from Abu Ghraib. You see that image. And I remember the first time, or when I went to Iraq in October 2003, people told me that in Abu Ghraib, the Americans were torturing people. In Abu Ghraib, the Americans were torturing people. And I, to my everlasting regret, discounted it. And that image of what America does and the gap between what it does and permits and what it says it stands for is, I think, the greatest and most wounding, painful consequence of the war on terror. And it's going to be the wound, I think, that will last the longest and be most difficult to heal.
I want to sort of open this up to all of you, but before we do that, let's see if we can't find some grounds for some optimism here. George, I noted in your book, you said this: the tide is about to turn. And I'd like you to elaborate a little on that. Do you feel
when did I say that?
Well, I'll have to see you after class on that. Do you believe it? I mean, I think I found it somewhere.
He said the price of gas was going to come down, I think.
Well, that's happening.
He said housing prices were going to completely collapse as well.
All right, let me put it this way. Do you believe the tide can turn?
Look, I believe we are a democracy. It has negative aspects. That's why the Democrats don't stand up, because they don't want to go against public opinion. But I think public opinion has shifted, and I think it needs to shift more. And I think public has to realize that this war on terror is a bad idea. And then I think the tide will turn. You see, that's what I think is still missing. And as Mark said, you know, the public still responds. When President Bush starts talking about the war on terror, there's a blip up in his popularity. Mm-hmm. And that has to change.
So does that leave you fundamentally pessimistic or optimistic? I mean, I agree with you, but do you think we're reaching that sort of tipping point moment where actually the citizenry will come to their senses?
I think we are close to a tipping point on it. I think that's why I'm pushing it, because I think that the time is ripe and I wish that some of our politicians would also see it and take a chance and say it. And some do. I think Senator Biden is on record as saying it. So I think we may be there. We may be at that point.
Can I jump in here? Because having watched the institutions in Washington not respond to, you know, as I said, some of the stories that came out, a couple things have happened that I think are optimistic if part of your goal is to have a debate about these tough questions. And one is that they've been undone to some extent by their secrecy. And there have been more reports that allow us to not only know, unfortunately, what waterboarding is, and not only to discuss it with some bizarre normalcy, but now we're at the point where we're having press conferences by the military interrogators saying, you know, we've studied this, and we don't think these coercive measures actually work that well. I mean, put aside the moral question and what it means to be a country that calls itself a human rights leader and then does it. Put that aside for a minute. Is it efficient? And so we are having these sorts of discussions now, which I think is a good note. And the other thing that has happened is the courts have stepped in finally. And I think that if you want to give the executive the benefit of the doubt for a minute and to say that they really do believe, as John Yoo here will state very eloquently, that they had a responsibility to protect the country at all means necessary. Now you have the courts finally stepping in on the behest of largely groups like the ACLU and Human Rights Watch, who took on these cases on behalf of individuals. I'm really weighing these questions and drawing lines that took them a long time to even get asked to draw. And now you have another branch of government, the legislature, being asked to either uphold that, or to say, well, actually, we want to try to draw new lines, as they are doing in debating the wiretapping cases now, where they might decide to retroactively okay things that weren't clearly okay before. So at least you have now, and you do have a vigorous fourth estate, and at least you do have now all the branches of government weighing in a way that they weren't doing in the last, in the first 5 years of this post 9/11 era.
So can I pursue that? Just throw in a little law talk here for a second, since Dana mentioned it. I want to say, offer a couple of cold thoughts. Don't count on law and the courts.
Spoken like a true law dean.
Yeah, I mean, no, it is. I mean, I say that only in the sense that, first of all, the courts haven't done the hard part yet. Mm-hmm. So far, the Supreme Court is basically, I mean, the key ruling simply said the executive branch was naughty to do some of the things it did without authorization from Congress. So they've reserved the question of, if and when Congress authorizes it, will we, the courts, declare it to be in violation of the Constitution or some international obligation, right? Now, on that latter point, will it ultimately, once authorized, so the first argument was the administration asserted that they had an inherent presidential authority to act without authorization from Congress. And you could debate it either way. I was frankly surprised that my colleague John Yoo, when this finally went to the Supreme Court, I was kind of surprised by the Supreme Court's ruling, because I thought that his position only had 2 votes, turned out to have 3 votes. But if anybody thinks that it's an extreme fringe view, he got 3 votes out of 9 on the Supreme Court, plus the president and the vice president and 2 attorneys general. And now, how did those 3 people get on the Supreme Court? And how did that president and that Secretary of Defense get in office? Answer: politics. So at the end of the day, the safeguard is not going to be, I fear, is not going to be through the courts. It's going to be through what happens in the democratic/political sphere.
Chris,
and I might also say that with respect to Mark's thing, look, I accept the criticism of the metaphor of balance. But again, just a cold hard fact, for those of you who don't want a balancing approach taken to issues of, for example, Fourth Amendment search and seizure or privacy, you need a different constitution, because the balancing approach is in fact in our Constitution. We're free from unreasonable searches and seizures. So the balancing is in there. It's in our Constitution. It's going to happen. I certainly agree that frequently it's posed as a trade-off when it doesn't have to be, which goes to the efficacy point that Dana just made. I certainly agree with that. But the absolutes are far and few between. They're going to be created, the bright lines, if they are to be found, are going to be created through politics and legislative action.
Could I add something to that?
Yeah, Mark, before you do, I want to ask one question, and then we'll get to your point. Listen, if the courts aren't going to do it, there's one other check and balance. 4 of us are journalists here. How do we assess the health of journalism?
Well, just one little remark, though, just before we get
Lowell and Mark.
The thing that surprised me over the last 4 years more than anything else in this role in the Fourth Estate is going to Washington, which I visit from Berkeley, which gives me a different perspective, and being in private conversations with members of Congress in regulatory roles in this area, and being told now regularly, we have no oversight. And they point to you and they say, you're the oversight.
Right.
Now that's a frightening thought.
Could I, on the journalist question, you know, I remember, I think my earliest awareness, or really political awareness, is, and certainly of the press, is of watching the Watergate hearings, lying on my parents' couch in the Adirondacks, watching them with great fascination, and having my mother in the background yell, "Go out and play, get out, stop watching television." And I think we probably all retain a notion of the way things should work from that model, the idealized model we have of it, which is, you have these three steps. The first is revelation, which comes perhaps a leak to the press, usually, on the front page of the Washington Post or wherever. Then the next step is investigation, and this isn't just the press. It's the institutions that we hold in common, the legislature, as happened with the Watergate or the Sam Ervin Committee and others.
Don't forget universities, Mark.
Well, I was getting that, Orville.
Just wanted to make sure.
Thank you. And the judiciary. So you have the second step, investigation. Then you have a third step, which really I'd call expiation or punishment, in which the wrongdoers go through a system that we all recognize after we've first determined the story through the courts, the legislature, and they're punished. And you have the society, to some degree, cleansing itself, purging itself, and going back to a state of grace, though it's never a state of grace. And that, hasn't been happening, partly because, as Christopher Edley pointed out, we're living in a one-party government, in part because that government has used fear so well. So we're stuck, in a sense, with revelation. We're stuck at that first step, and we have what I've called frozen scandals. They're sitting there in front of us. We look at them every day. Anna Priest, I think, did her first piece, if I'm not mistaken, on interrogation in December 2002. So this has been sitting in front of us, for nearly 4 years now. Abu Ghraib is more than 2 years back. So when you look at the press, I feel like things have been revealed, not as much as people want, but the problem is the sequela to that, the consequence. What happens next? And, people hope the election, you'll have an adversary voice, perhaps. Investigations will be pursued, perhaps. And we will have an answer to that. I wanted to comment on Christopher Edley's point about don't look to the courts. I'm saying don't look to journalists. You're saying don't look to the courts. George will say don't look to the foundations and financiers. Well, Orville will say don't look to the journalism school. But I think that when I look at that decision, when I look at the Hamdan decision, I'm not a lawyer or a law school dean, but I think what strikes me is the reference, the decision that the Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention does apply. This decision to, which various people in the human rights community have been saying for years, this kind of common article that sets out the things that cannot be done and the bare minimum treatment of all prisoners in any war, or a particular kind of war is stated there. But that decision strikes me as most consequential and most interesting in the way it dovetails with some of the points George Soros makes in his book, because it raises things to another level, which is to the level of international law. And this administration has a very, very radical view, a very unusual view in our history of international law. I mean, this country, in large part after the Second World War, created the multilateral institutions that we see in front of us, whether you like them or not, from Bretton Woods, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, et cetera. We could name others. But insofar as there is an international law, the United States was very much central in starting it under the belief that, this increases our power. Even though we're the most powerful state, international law will increase our power, will help us lead the world. And this administration has an opposite view of things. It believes, and George talks about this, that power is essentially a zero-sum game, that power is raw power, that preponderance of power that we can use. And I have to read you a very brief quote that I love from the President's National Security Strategy of 2003. If you haven't read this, you got to read it. It's a great, you'll love it. And the quote is, "Other powers will seek to challenge us, employing the weapons of the weak, including judicial processes, international fora, and terror." So I'm not making that up. Now this is a document that the government puts together, which is a public statement. George Bush famously said, "I want it so clear that the boys down in Waco can understand it." And this sets out the public position of the government on its military national security strategy. And they have grouped together as asymmetrical tools of warfare the United Nations and other international fora, judicial processes, which is to say the courts, and terrorism. This is the way that weaker powers are able to get over on the United States, which is the most powerful state. So the administration is very unusual in that it views international law as, by definition, anathema and threatening by virtue of the fact that the United States is most powerful and can achieve what it wants to through its power. And to get back to Orwell's point, or begging question, pathetic question about optimism, plaintive question, I should say, about optimism, I think one place we can draw a little bit of optimism is that argument, at the cost of a great deal of blood, has been disproved. That, Iraq is one of the great demonstrations that Napoleon said, you can do everything with a bayonet except sit on it. I mean, you can't build a lasting order simply through military force. You need to have wisdom, you need to have political persuasion, you need all of the tools of soft power, which this administration has largely besmirched and discarded.
Or can we take up your question on the Fourth Estate for a minute? Because I think that if you had a
Yes,
little...
now, I want you to take it up, but after Dana speaks, we're going to, I hate to say it, we've been here an hour and a half already, and we're going to stop in about 15 minutes. I want each of you to have a few final comments, but let's get to the Fourth Estate.
Well, I was going to say that if they had a little more space, they probably would have added the media in that long line of groups.
I don't think we're important enough to be added to
certain media.
Certain media. That gives me the entree to say what I really want to say about the mainstream media, because that's me and Lowell when he will admit it, and some of the and some of the hopefully people out here from the journalism school. And there's this, as much as I'm very proud of what the mainstream media did to uncover a lot of the things that we've been talking about tonight, there is this bad trend happening that's hugely unhealthy that I want to describe briefly. And that is that in places like Berkeley and a lot of other places on the West Coast and on the East Coast, the mainstream media's credibility and the value that people place on it has so diminished for a lot of reasons, and part of it is the polarization, I think, of the world and our world, but also it is people forgetting that the left and the right blog using information that comes from somewhere, and it's not from them, it's from the mainstream media, and they put their own twist on it. But that would be okay if it weren't for another trend that's really equally as powerful, and that is the economic situation of the mainstream media in America. You see newspapers dying all the time. You see big newspaper staffs like our own and the New York Times cutting their staff, and then shrinking places like the investigative staffs. And without them, you aren't going to have because we're really the only institutions, by and large, with some exceptions, that have the resources to let people like me work on a story for a month. And I wish that were different and that there were more outlets that could do that, but that's just the way it is. And so as much as, so that you have two divergent things happening that unless they turn around will not be healthy in the long run for the importance of a press and having a vibrant press.
All right, everybody's going to get 2 or 3 minutes to make some concluding remarks. Let's start with you, Lowell, because you may have thoughts that follow on Dana's.
Well, to follow directly on it, the threat that today to the mainstream media, to the institutions like the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times, or even what's left of network television news that can do anything in depth, is really severe. It's actually irrational, at least so far. George Soros may be able to explain it to me. I've been trying for months to understand why an institution that can make $1 billion a year in revenue and 24% profit is in danger. But that is the situation today at the Los Angeles Times, for instance. So there are all kinds of things going on right now in the background that do threaten those of us who people in Congress say are the only people doing oversight. And I think it's something that we have to have a larger discussion about, particularly in academic institutions and educational institutions in general. I did want to say something about hope, if you will, and positive things, and maybe it involves the fifth estate or the people. There are some things that have happened in the recent past related to the population in the United States who have spontaneously done things that no one predicted, that no one wrote anything about really or communicated to them, that have taken place. For example, when the FCC was about to lift the ban on, not the limit on the number of television licenses that any particular network could own, it's now at about 35. There was a spontaneous outpouring of mail and protests from all over the United States, even though the network television never reports on this subject, and the subject is usually in the back pages of newspapers, and it stopped the FCC in its tracks. So there seem to be, from time to time, issues where the public actually gets organized more or less on its own, and things do happen. And maybe there is a restive spirit out there that'll make some difference, although I'm not sure it will be in the coming election, because it seems that we are going to again see this fear of Al-Qaeda coming back, because if we don't continue to fight them overseas, they'll be here in our streets.
Chris Edley.
First, I want to encourage everybody to buy George Soros's new book. It's really exceptionally, it's intellectually bracing, and I think it's short. And I think that. No, but
pithy,
no, really, and
pithy.
it's rich with philosophy and geopolitics and history, and even some finance and all kinds of stuff. I mean, it could get him a tenured chair in any of 5 departments on campus, even if he didn't pay for them. So I would encourage you to. So I'd encourage you to go out and I'd encourage you to buy it because he needs the cash. So there's a chance, there's just a chance, I hope this isn't too radical an idea, but there's just a chance that a world-leading research institution with a public mission could contribute to this problem. There's just a chance that if you take a really hard question, be it opium production in Afghanistan or understanding the relationship between fundamentalist religion and international politics or ... Just a chance that some of the best scholars and most inspired students on the face of the planet, if we bestirred ourselves to focus on these questions with an intentionality that befits our public mission, it's just a chance that we could make a contribution. It seems to me that we're one of the few institutions, as the last several minutes have suggested, we're one of the few institutions that may have what it takes to make intellectually sound, intellectually honest attacks on these harrowing issues. And I think it's beginning in various places around campus, or I should say accelerating in various places around campus. And we should probably try to figure out a way to do that on an even grander and more ambitious scale. I have to say, finally, on a less uplifting note, that that from outside of journalism, I always have the problem that my many experiences in government service and in politics have left me with a frightening history, these experiences, that it is very rare that I read a news account on a subject about which I know a lot and don't find serious flaws in it. There are a wide range of kinds of criticism of journalism, so I actually wonder whether it may fit kind of the boom-bust paradigm, the issues of reflexivity that George discusses in his book. I worry that broad support for the Fourth Estate may be at such a low ebb that the support needed to rally around the role of an independent media may be failing just when its role as watchdog could become among the most important in our nation's history.
Dana, just by chance, you're next.
Well, I don't think I could state that any better, so I wanted to change the subject. And other than to say go buy a newspaper tomorrow morning, the huge disparity that I have studied and watched in Washington and the government writ large and wrote a book about has to do with having a powerful, effective, growing, well-funded military that we ask not only to fight an actual war in terms of tactics and operations, but to do things that the military doesn't want to do, isn't trained to do, and ultimately doesn't do well, which is all the non-military things. Everything from peacekeeping and nation building in places like Kosovo and Iraq to carrying out the message about who we are as Americans overseas, because chances are these days foreigners will come across a soldier and that will be their impression of the United States. And even the best trained soldiers are still soldiers with battle rattle and weapons.
19 years old.
19 years old. So we have, and this goes to George's book as well, where are the institutions and the competent people and the power base in our government to really accept and carry forward with the idea that the war on terror does not have a military solution, it has a political and a social solution. And that's where I am not so... That's where I'm not so optimistic, because the government and the military recognize this, but it never seems to really change. And so I look to institutions like this to say, you know, it is the State Department, so I'm going to talk in government terms since that's what I write most about. It's the State Department in any country in the world that is supposed to dominate the policy that is the United States policy in that country, and yet the State Department continues to be an atrophied organization that can't even make its case on Capitol Hill. And I think until that changes, there'll be a bureaucratic incentive that will keep the military at the forefront of the war on terror, and that's not a good thing.
Mark Danner.
Well, I took George's book with me on the plane today from Washington and found a lot of people were interested in it, on the consequence of the war on terror. The guy who searched my bags, he took away all my fluids and then, was very interested in the book. My person sitting next to me was very interested, kept eyeing it sort of from the side. I would add to the general blurb fest here on the book and urge you to read it, for not only because of the thoughts that, the provocative thoughts about where our polity is now and where we are as a people, but also the fact that George is a guy who read Popper in college and still takes what he read in college seriously as a guide to his entire life. And that's rather unusual. It's like watching a science experiment when you actually read this, because I read Popper in college as well, and it's extraordinary that, in fact, he read something that was a revelation to him that spoke to the time he spent in Hungary at the end of the war and later under the communists, and used it to motivate and guide a career in investments and also become a public intellectual in a very rare sense. So, so I do urge you to read it. You know, I'm thinking the final words here that my father is a kind of amateur historian, and he spent, when we drove in the car when I was a very little kid in long trips, he would talk to me about history, about Sarajevo, the beginning of World War I, about ancient Jerusalem. He had these set pieces that I used to love, and the Red Scare after World War II. I was a little older then. But it strikes me that we condescend to the past habitually. That is, we look back at the Palmer Raids, the Red Scare, we look back at Korematsu, the internment of the Japanese, and we say, how could they do that? If only they knew, you know, how could they do that? How ignorant were they? And it strikes me now that those people somewhere are looking forward to us and saying, think what you would do if you were in the same position as we were. And indeed, we have reacted in a rather similar way, which suggests that the United States, when it comes to threat, when it comes to fear, when it comes to violence, when it comes to the threat of internal subversion in particular, has certain national characteristics in how it reacts and how it lives up to and honors and doesn't honor its ideas of what it is as a society. We've become, over the last 5 years, it seems to me, we've gone from a nation that doesn't torture to one that tortures when it needs to, which is an extraordinary passage and one that bears reflection. I have one last point, which is that the 9/11 attacks were, among other things, in addition to being a recruiting poster for al-Qaeda, a horrible recruiting poster, they were an effort to drive the American people to think about their policies in the Middle East. One of the thoughts was that Americans would look at the support that their government gave to Saudi Arabia, the support to Egypt, and so on, and would perhaps withdraw that support. And that would be the way, because al-Qaeda isn't interested in the United States, only insofar as it supports repressive regimes that they want to remove. And it's interesting to me that while the recruiting poster side of that worked, the determined attempt to start a national conversation about American policy, what it does in the Middle East, and other parts of the world, utterly failed. And part of that is, I think, the determined position of the government that they attack us, as George said, for what we are, not for what we do. They hate our freedoms. And that, I think, is one of the enduring fallacies and one of the enduring pities of the last 5 years.
Before we ask George Soros to say a few words and take us out, I just want to tell you all that an event like this does not happen without a lot of people doing a lot of work. And I want to particularly thank, in my office, Kaylee Cusick, Leah Thompson, and Marcia Parker for putting all of this together. Now, George, you began.
It's very hard to say a last word because there's so much to be said.
Ask them to buy your book.
Two thoughts, but you've already said that, so I don't think it's appropriate for me to say. There are two thoughts that your remarks brought to mind. One is, I find it mind-boggling that our professional interrogators inflicted humiliation as a way of dealing with the prisoners that they took in Iraq, and of course also it started earlier in Guantanamo. Because it was not just torture, but particularly it was humiliation. The idea was that they would break the will of these people or in some way. But then, since most of them were innocent, they had to be let out. And of course, that was a tremendous inducement for further resistance. I talked to an intelligence officer who just came back from Anbar province, and he said it was really in the prison that the insurgents were trained. And of course that very often happens in prison. It's not just in Iraq, but the stupidity of actually inflicting humiliation in particular. And how can that be explained? It's only because of this distinction between us and them, that we are inflicting humiliation on them. And all the measures that are taking, all the legal measures, it's all directed against them. And we count the soldiers killed, but we don't count the Iraqis who are killed. And as long as you distinguish between us and them, we really disqualify ourselves from being the leaders of the world. So this is what we have to... The other thought that came to mind is that, as you were talking, that the terrorists really hit a soft spot in our psyche, our fear of death. Mm-hmm. And it's an ironic thing that when I first started my foundation in the United States, when I set up programs here, two of the first programs, one was a program on death in America, based on the fact that we deny death. We don't know how to deal with it, and therefore the process is more painful than it needs to be. And this was actually a very successful program, making the caregivers, the doctors and the nurses aware of to confront death in their treatment. And the other one was a drug policy, because I felt that the war on drugs is doing more harm than drugs themselves. And that was 10 years ago. And then to have the war on terror, where these two themes, so to speak, come together, I find that sort of quite ironic. So that's my last one.
Well, join me in thanking our 5 panelists, and thanks to all of you for coming.